Death is something we all face. There's a sign they used to post at the entrance of graveyards which says, "As you are now, I once was. As I am now, you soon will be." And as you walk through a graveyard, I suggest this is reasonable to consider. All these people underneath these stones, well, whose bodies are underneath these stones, were once walking around like you, and on the grand scale, it wasn't all that long ago. Really, their life turned out to be surprisingly short. Epicurus tells his disciples that they should think death is nothing to us. The basic idea here is it doesn't hurt to not exist. More technically, the only intrinsic good is pleasure and the only bad is pain. Death is the cessation of existence, so once dead, nothing good or bad can happen to one. But let's look at the argument in some detail and ask ourselves, is this a valid argument and is it a sound argument? First premise says that upon death I will cease to exist. Some people think this is true by definition. It's not true by definition. What's agreed is that a person who dies assumes room temperature, they stop breathing, their brain stops functioning, their heart stops beating. Everybody agrees on that. That's what we call death. Not everybody agrees that the human person thereby ceases to exist. Some people believe that, and many people in the world deny it. They believe that when a person's body dies, the person still exists, now just as a disembodied soul. Later on in the course, we'll look a little bit more at those ideas. But let's keep going with this argument for now. Second premise says that after death I will experience neither pleasure nor pain. And this isn't an independent premise. This is supposed to follow from one. Third step says that the only good is my pleasure and the only bad is my pain. That's his egoistic hedonism. Fourth step, my death will be neither good nor bad for me, neither a gain nor a loss for me. And the conclusion is that therefore I should neither look forward to nor fear my own death. And just to fill out the structure of the argument, 1 and 3 are independent premises. Let's just underline those. Step 2 follows from 1. Step 4 follows from 2 and 3. And 5 follows from 4. So that's the whole argument. The first question to ask about it is it valid? That is it the case that if all 4 of these are true, then that would force the conclusion to be true? Arguably, it is valid. It's maybe not as obviously valid as some arguments are, but I don't see any obvious logical mistake here. So it looks like if we then accept both of these premises, the independent premises 1 and 3, then we will have already committed ourselves to the conclusion, which is that one should neither look forward to nor fear one's own death. We can say a little bit more about this argument. Epicurus has highly developed views, and he says some things in defense of each of these premises. What he says in support of premise 1 is his atomism, his theory of atomism. He thinks that all things are material things, and that all of these material things break down ultimately into smallest components which cannot be themselves divided. So atom comes from the Greek word cut. That's what the root tom is from, and a means not. So atomism is the doctrine that if you disassemble physical things, you will eventually reach a smallest part. You'll reach the smallest level of parts which themselves cannot be divided. They're uncuttable smallest bits. You cannot infinitely divide physical objects. We won't in this class go into Epicurus's grounds for his atomism. We will just note here that if you're an atomist, that seems to support premise 1. You might wonder, does Epicurus believe in a soul? He does believe in a soul, but he thinks it's material. So when a person dies, their body disintegrates. Eventually, it basically falls apart, right? And he believes that the soul is a subtle, invisible kind of matter, and upon death, apparently, the atoms that form the soul just scatter. In defense of 3, he seems to think that this is just directly experienced. That everybody, if they will just examine their own experience, they will see that they immediately perceive that the only good is one's own pleasure and the only bad is one's own pain. That is intrinsic good, intrinsic bad. This, of course, is very controversial, and I would say that most philosophers don't accept it. Sometimes he also argues for this, basically arguing that anything else that you seek, really you're seeking for the sake of pleasure or for avoiding pain. So he does, in a way, argue for that as well. What do you think about this argument? Do you accept that it's valid? Do you accept premises 1 and 3? One might think that to claim this argument is unsound, one has to be a dualist. This isn't necessarily so. If you think that there are intrinsically valuable things other than pleasure, that will cause you to deny premise 3. As you consider this argument, let me suggest this sort of example. Consider when a young person dies. For some reason, we're a lot more upset when a young person dies than when a really, really old person dies. If you're 95 and you die, people say, oh, well, he or she had a good run. It's kind of to be expected. I had an acquaintance when I was in high school, I believe it was the 11th grade. One day he was out mowing his lawn. Some crazy driver swerved off the road and ran him down and killed him while he was mowing his lawn. And people were very upset about this. A lot of my friends knew this guy better than I did. Now, why are we so upset? And is this a reasonable view? You might think that we're upset because we think there are intrinsic goods other than pleasure. As you consider then what your own view of this argument is, you should ask yourself what you say about that sort of case. Do you accept premise 3 and why? Do you accept premise 1 and why? Epicurus, as I mentioned, tends to just write in his own voice and not want to directly interact with previous writings. At the same time, Epicurus and the Epicurean school of philosophy had detailed responses to its rival schools. And I want to now go through the responses that I think that they would make to the theories that we've seen so far. Epicurus would agree, I think, with Glaucon that justice is only an instrumental good, that being a good person is something that we should seek, but only as a means to pleasure and the avoidance of pain. I don't think he would agree with Glaucon that we should actively seek a good reputation. I take it that desire for a good reputation would, for Epicurus, be a natural but unnecessary desire. Epicurus would disagree with Plato about the status of justice or righteousness or being a good person. Again, Epicurus thinks that justice is only an instrumental good, worthy of being sought only for the sake of what comes from it. Because of this, he would deny Plato's claim that happiness just is being good or being virtuous. Epicurus would argue, no, that's completely wrong. Epicurus would argue that we only value moral virtues and in general rationality and self-control because they lead to happiness. They are all instrumental and not intrinsic goods. However, Epicurus does think that a person who takes his recommendations will achieve all the real virtues. An Epicurean should be a good friend, should obey the laws of her country, should be courageous, should be rational, should be self-controlled, and so on. Epicurus would agree with Aristotle that the chief good, the ultimate thing we are seeking, is happiness, that is, being well off. But he would strongly disagree with Aristotle about what happiness is. On the interpretation we looked at, Aristotle thinks that happiness is a very complicated thing. It requires a life of activity in accordance with moral and intellectual virtue and enough external goods. Epicurus would argue that happiness requires much, much less than Aristotle says. And contrary to Aristotle, probably almost anyone, if not anyone, can be happy, and it's really totally up to you whether or not you're happy. Aristotle's views include that happiness requires good fortune, that there are things that can deprive you of happiness over which you have no control. Epicurus seems to disagree with this. The only things that could deprive you of peace of mind are pains, mental or physical, but those are defeatable or resistible. When Aristotle argues against the view that a happy life is a pleasant life or a life of pleasure, Epicurus would respond that we have to distinguish other pleasures from tranquility, from ataraxia, which is the highest sort of pleasure. He would agree with Aristotle that a life of bodily pleasures, a life of food and drink, a life of partying and fun, he would agree that that is not a flourishing life. But he thinks that if we focus on the right sort of pleasure, then that's just what happiness is for a human being.